Okay, thanks for coming, everybody. We're experiencing some technical difficulties with our demos. So the demo gods got me again. I love it. I love it. This is the exact same setup I used in Calgary a couple weeks ago, and for some reason, the laptop doesn't want to talk to that projector. So I'll do some shadow puppets to help fill the time. All right, so we're going to talk about AppV 5.0 in this session. My name is Tim Mangan from Team Merchant Technologies. What we do is sort of specialize on AppV. I'm a Microsoft MVP for the product and have been looking at the new version of AppV for quite a while now. So we saw the first inklings of a version of this a little over a year ago, and they've been keeping us up to date. Yesterday, Microsoft did what they always do to me. They released a new version just before I come to BriForum to speak about AppV. Fortunately, I guessed that would happen. So they don't tell us exactly when they're going to release, but last week they did give me the beta 2 bits available to me. So we set everything up, we tested out. There's a bunch of new functionality that comes in a new service pack. We'll be talking about that stuff here. I'd have loved to have actually shown you a bunch of that stuff live. We had some great demos set up that Patrick was going to run. But I think we'll leave you pretty well informed about what's new here in AppV 5.0. So the current shipping release is 4.6 SP1. And there is a beta for AppV 5.0 now. You would get to that from Connect. So you log into connect.com and sign up for the MDOP AppV beta. There's actually 2 betas that are out there. One of them is for AppV 5.0, and then there's another beta that's called 4.6 Service Pack 2. And 4.6 Service Pack 2 adds the support in for Windows 8. Okay, so and primarily in AppV, one of the big things that goes on is that you end up you have a choice of either assigning individual virtualized packages to particular operating systems or let them all go. Well, they needed to release a new service pack, if for nothing else than to get us the Windows 8 names in the checkboxes for that. But they did make a few other changes, and those changes appear to be related primarily to working with AppV 5.0. So we'll talk about that as we go on. But 4.6.2 also has a beta that's out there, and you can get that from Connect as well. Now, Microsoft has not disclosed any release plan for either of these products. We really don't know when they're going to release. That's a question lots of people have been asking me, and I'm not lying. I'm not hiding the information from you because of my NDA. They don't even tell us. So we don't know. But the good news is that makes me perfectly free to speculate because I can't be violating anything if they didn't tell me, right? So AppV traditionally has released in a February-ish time frame, so sometime during the first quarter. Given where they were with the first beta, I was really kind of doubting that they would even hit that window. With the second beta, I think this beta is a little more feature complete, and maybe they'll be able to get themselves there. I did note in the little license agreement that you're supposed to agree to whenever you go and install one of these components, there was a note in beta 2 that said that your license was valid for 120 days or until release of the final product, whichever comes first. So that leads me to believe that at least within 120 days, we're going to see something else. Now, will it be a release candidate, or are they really going to accelerate this and do the full release at that point? I can't really say. Okay, so a little history about AppV. I was the VP of development for a company called Softricity, and our first version was released 2.0, and that went out in beta in, because I'm stepping on that? Okay, thank you. There we go. So release 2.0 went out in beta in the fall of 2001 and was released in 2002. That release was based on Windows NT as the primary client deployment platform. That was the dominant platform out there. Windows 2000 was the new one. And that drove a lot of the design decisions that we made at that point. What Microsoft is doing with 5.0 is, in essence, rewriting the entire platform. They've taken a step back, they've taken a look and said, okay, what makes sense in today's world? So for example, on Windows NT, if you wanted to mount a share on your local operating system, you could only do that to a drive letter. There was no idea of mounting to a folder level at all. So that led to the famous Q drive that AppV uses for the virtualization store at the client, where you had to designate a single drive letter that worked across the entire enterprise. And that's always been a sticking point for people adopting the technology. Now, why did we have to have the same drive letter on all of the different machines? Well, the primary reason for that was that a lot of applications would hide references to files inside all sorts of proprietary files that they had inside their application package. And the purpose of what we do in AppV in the sequencing is to make that package be machine and user neutral in terms of its format. So it goes through, the sequencer goes through and tries to extract and find all of those references and change them out using some kind of like environment variables that we can then use at the client to say, oh, okay, here's where things are now. But some old applications would hide references. They'd have like a .dat file that had file references in it. And AppV just wouldn't know to go into those particular files to look for it. So as a way to make all of those applications work, we said, look, let's just pick a drive letter, we sequence using that drive letter, and we make sure every client out there mounts the virtual application directory onto the same drive letter, and then those hidden references work. So that's what we did, and that solved a lot of applications problems. Now, over the years, the application vendors have gotten better about how they configure their products. They use the registry much more. If a file reference is in the registry, the sequencer is going to find it and take care of that for us. So there's a lot less of that going on. And a little over 2 years ago, I started the process in my lab of sequencing everything without sequencing it to the Q drive and testing it on different drive letters. And quite frankly, I was very surprised at how few applications had a problem. So the vendors have gotten a lot better, and also the sequencer's gotten better at finding things too. Okay. Some of the things that we did along the way, so AppV started out primarily being a solution for Citrix. Okay, so terminal services, solving the problem of multi-user application, the need for multi-user applications with vendors who didn't write their applications to be multi-user aware, or multi-tenant aware. That was the other thing. We had a lot of ASPs in the early end of the business. So they had to worry about multiple customers running the same application on the same server. We also needed to take care of applications which were written in a way that required the user to have rights that you typically don't want them to have, particularly on a terminal server. So like the ability to write to that configuration file that's in C, program files, vendor name, whatever. Usually we want to have that in a lockdown environment, certainly within a terminal server, as well as HKey local machine, software, vendor, whatever, right? Those are areas you need to protect one user from another. So that was a big part of what we were doing in the early days. When we built the product, though, we really viewed the desktop as being the ultimate destination for the product. But we saw this fantastic opportunity there with the terminal server and went after that in the early days. Now, Microsoft has been going through the product these last few sets of releases, and they've kind of been going through it a part at a time. So in, 4.5 was more about security. I mean, that was the first big release, Microsoft having acquired the company. went through a big security audit, and they had to fix a lot of little things that they found around the way. And that was pretty much across the board. 4.6, it's with 4.6 was mostly about the client. And this is the first time that we got that 64-bit version of the client that we've been waiting for a long time. So it was focused around there. SP1 was focused around the sequencer. So in the sequencer, they wanted to improve the user interface and the ability of an average person to be able to come in and sequence something relatively successfully the first time that they do it. And they had some success in that area, although quite frankly, I think they made it harder for people who know what they're doing to sequence applications, ironically. And so we've been getting questions from customers, is the management server going to continue to stay as part of the product family? Because they hadn't touched the management server in quite a while. Some of those security fixes were really around that management server, and they made some changes to the database there. But for the large part, the functionality that's there has been the same, or actually a little bit less, because in all of the reports that come out of AppV with the management server, they've been kind of removing some reports as they go along. So people were concerned about that. But Microsoft had pretty much committed that, they were committed to continuing to have the management server as part of the feature, that you have a management server way to deploy things, you've got the standalone client, and you've got SCCM. And in their view, the management server was supposed to be sort of like the good answer for you, and SCCM is the best answer. Now, they weren't exactly on a feature parity, and there were a lot of things that you couldn't do with SCCM with AppV in 4.6, particularly prior to SCCM 2012, you couldn't deploy effectively using SCCM to a terminal server. So Microsoft has sort of addressed that stuff in here, but now what we find in 5.0 is we've got a brand new management server that's been written from scratch. Okay. So what changes? So these are the things that are the primary things that I want to talk about during this session. They've updated the file system, the server itself, that management server, or what we used to call the full infrastructure server. I've actually noticed that name was still in the beta documentation when I was looking through that today. The sequencer has been updated. Not a radical change in terms of the user interface. I think they have stayed with a lot of what they did with 4.6 SP1. There are a couple of small tweaks that they made to make the process work better, but it's more of the output of the sequencer that changes. The client has changed. We have new management consoles across the board here, and there's much more transparency in the product. One of the problems with AppV in the past has been there's been these all sorts of little dark holes here and there that either weren't documented or weren't well documented and people didn't really understand. And what they're trying to do is to make the system much more transparent, and I think they've been successful there. They've also rewritten the way we do scripting. I really like the new scripting stuff they have in there. I think there are some things we still need to try to get them to tweak, but it gives us much more capabilities. We'll talk about that. And a new thing called connection groups, which replaces the dynamic suite composition that we've had since 4.5, I believe. Okay, so let's start talking about the file system. When we created the AppV file system, we needed to create something that didn't exist out in the world at that point. So we created our own file system. We hired a company who were experts in developing file systems on Windows, on the Windows platform, OSR, and we delivered them a set of specs of what we needed in our file system that was unique. And basically what it comes down to is that whole streaming functionality piece. So if you look at something like NTFS or NFS or any of the other commercial file systems that are out there, if you have an executable sitting on a share that's on another machine somewhere and you want to do something with that, the entire executable has to come over into memory locally before anything could start up. And what we wanted was a file system that we could point over and say, just bring over the pieces we need now and let the other ones come over later. Okay? Technically, this was called a reverse sparse matrix file system. I still have no idea what the hell that means. Okay? But that's the term for it. And so that's what a lot of the patents that Microsoft was looking for when they acquired Softricity was all around that file system. And so that's where the SFT file system really came from. Internally, we refer to that as the jigsaw file system, because we ultimately took the files that came in as part of the package and we just kind of cut them all up and chopped them up. And to some extent, we kind of viewed this and marketed it to ISVs in the early days as a security feature. That if somebody actually sniffed the wire and watched your software going across the wire, that they wouldn't really be able to take it and reconstruct it and reproduce your software application. So streaming was a safe thing to do. And the ISVs actually bought that. That was good. That was good. All right. So they're changing the file system in 5.0. The SFT file that we know and love goes away. It gets replaced by a file that's called .appv. Now, ultimately, the .appv file is based on the zip file format compression, okay? So it's a standard thing that they've got, the zlib compression that they've got support for inside the operating system kernel. So we'll get nice, efficient decompressions that way. But it's not just a .zip file. It still has streaming capability. It has information about where things are supposed to be. So one of the first things that people love to do after they first sequence a package, they see the .appv file, they hear that it's really zip, you rename it to .zip, and you open it up in the zip thing, and you can see what's in there. And that's cool, and that's part of that transparency stuff I was talking about. But if you make any changes to that and close and save that file, you'll have a broken package, okay? Because things won't be in the right place. So if you do want to do that type of look around, what I really recommend is make a copy of that file first, rename that to .zip, and open it up and snoop around. Okay. One of the other things that happens with moving away from the SFT format is we finally get past this 4 gigabyte limit. In the past, packages were limited to 4 gigabytes. Now that was 4 gigabytes after compression, and that 4 gigabyte number was an approximate number because it would break at some point. And we never really knew where. Now that limit is, as far as we know, completely gone. One of the packages that I have on the laptop that disappeared is a 6 gigabyte package that I created, and that works just fine. We've asked the question, is there a limit up there somewhere? And the answer has been, well, we don't really know, but no one's really going to run into one if there is one. So I think we're okay with that. The Q drive goes away, okay? All the mounting that happens for these virtual packages are now on a folder basis, so we eliminated the need for that thing, which is going to make it a lot easier, excuse me, for new customers to take this on. The RTSP protocol goes away. For the past few years, I've been recommending to customers that either UNC mounting of the packages or using an HTTP type style of streaming is really just as good as using RTSP for getting the package down there. I mean, you can argue the merits in terms of performance, is one a little bit better than the other, but they're close enough it didn't really matter. But by using those protocols, we could really simplify our operations. And Microsoft seems to have agreed with me finally, and they've gone and they've removed the RTSP protocol completely. So everything is going to be done using either UNC references or URL references to get the packages out. Okay. We are still doing file level streaming within it. Streaming doesn't go away, which is good. And then there's a change to the way we have background streaming. So in 4.6, Microsoft introduced background streaming to the client. So you get this virtual application. It comes down to the client in terms of the publishing information, and then all the bits itself can sort of stream down in the background. When they did the implementation, it was a pretty aggressive background streaming. The nature of background was based on the CPU usage of the client machine at that time, which meant if you had a lot of clients that all got the package at the same time and no one was sitting there, they'd all try to pull the thing down as fast as they possibly could. So in 5.0, that background streaming becomes a very, very slow trickle. It's actually too slow as far as I'm concerned. But you know, they're thinking about big environments here. The user can still use the package because we do have on-demand streaming. So they can start the application and things will come down. But if you just sit there and let it sit there and watch, you'll see that thing takes a really long time to come down. That 6 gigabyte package I talked about would be about 4 hours before it would fully come down, even on a totally idle networking client. So it is rather slow. The other, yeah, question?
So with the Q drive gone, what's the default location for the packages?
Okay, it is about 70 characters long. Okay, so it's C, program data, Microsoft, AppV, the package GUID, the package version GUID, and that's where it gets mounted in. Okay, so one of the things that Microsoft added 4.6-ish, I think, I don't think it was SP1, might have been SP1, was the idea of a read-only cache for a client. So they put this in for the idea of VDI, rather than caching all of these virtual applications down to each individual VM, particularly if you were thinking about something like a non-persistent VM where you're just going to throw it away anyway. They wanted the ability to have one copy of the cache and have everyone just kind of point into it and read it out off of there. In a VDI environment, that really makes sense from a disk space level without really impacting performance, because ultimately, even if everything is cached in the VM, it's still going out to the same SAN to actually do the read into memory anyway. So whether it's one VM SAN file for your VM with the cache in it, or if it's just the VM for your VDI image and then this other file that it's referencing, performance-wise, it didn't really matter. But it was really ugly to configure and maintain. So there are very few people who actually used it. So they have changed that methodology here in AppV 5.0, and they've done what looks to me to be a really good job. All of the hassle associated with the maintenance aspects of that from the 4.6 implementation are totally gone. Basically what you have is you're going to ultimately always have some sort of file share where you have all your packages stored, and the clients are going to get stuff published to them, and they're going to go and bring it down. And if you have the client normally configured, that means the client's going to do this background streaming and cache the whole thing locally on the machine. If you turn on this background remote client access, they call it, feature, what it'll do is it will, at publishing time, just have that basic information to understand the package. Then when you run things, it will actually pull it from the original source, from that content share, into memory, just as it would if you tried to run it without letting it fully download first. But rather than save that out to disk, it's just going to stay in memory until you're done with the application, and it's going to go away. So if you think about that VDI scenario, or even a Zen app scenario now, we can build these things and not have to have this extra cache on every VM that we're wanting to run these apps on. So that looks pretty good to me. I got no questions on that? Wow. Okay. Okay, so the sequencer. Oh, I know what we can do. We can still remote in. Yeah, maybe we can do that. All right. A sequencer. The UI hasn't changed very much. It's very much like the 4.6 SP1 user interface. The one change they made was the one that I think they needed the most, which is the ability to do application editing no matter which of the scenarios you go through in the sequencer. So what they did is they built a sequencer with these wizards that are now scenario based. So if I go to sequence an application, I first tell it, oh, I'm doing a new application, or I'm sequencing a plugin to something, or I'm sequencing some middleware. And on the basis of which of those things you choose, you may or may not see certain screens. One of the important screens was the ability to edit all of the shortcuts and file associations. But you could only get at that screen if you said you were sequencing a new application, which is why we started training everyone to say, yeah, you see those other two things there? Don't ever touch them. Just always say I'm doing a new app, right? So what they did in 5.0 is they took the application editing and they moved it as a tab in that multi-tabbed interface at the end of sequencing that I refer to as the sequencing editor, although there's no technical name for it that I know of. And they put it there. So no matter which of those paths you go, you'll always have the ability to do that. That solves like 80% of the problems people have with the wizards right there with that one change. And that's the primary change in the sequencer. Another change will be obviously a different file format that is putting things out. But they've also, because we removed the Q drive, this whole bit about where you're installing to is a little bit different. In the past, you were suggested that you would have a folder on that Q drive and you would install applications to there. Now what you'll see at that stage of the wizard is going to ask for your package name, and then it's going to ask you where you're going to install it to. And you'll name the folder there. Now, Microsoft's current recommendation is that you will type in C:program files wherever that application normally wants to install, and then install it to that folder. Now, a lot of times, I don't exactly know what the name is going to be, right? It's going to be C:program files, well, it's an Adobe thing. Maybe it's going to be Adobe and then something. I never really know. So rather than have to install the thing once to figure it out and then revert my machine and go back, I've been taking the practice of just saying, hey, it's going to be C: and whatever my package name is. And then when I get to installing the application, I say, put it in that folder that I designated earlier. And that's what I've been doing. I'm not sure if that's going to be best practice. Microsoft has clearly recommended that whatever folder you say needs to be the folder that you install things to. I've seen some things in the product, and I have a feeling, and I haven't quite found one yet, but there are going to be applications where we need to install it in a different folder to get it to work. So that's some of what we're going to have to figure out by the time this thing gets released. But for now, you know, if you just put it in C, wherever folder you designate, install it to that folder, you're more likely to be successful, would be my advice. What else is here? Yeah, security descriptors. How many people here, I'm assuming we have a lot of people here who use AppV already? Yes? Okay, a fair amount, okay. So how many people here using AppV 4.6 or above disable that checkbox that says enable security descriptors? Yeah, a lot of you, okay. So that feature goes away here. Security descriptors are going to be enabled on your packages. And the checkbox is gone. So what that means is that some of those applications, and these are going to be the legacy ones, that want to write particularly files, because we're talking about security descriptors on files, not on the virtual registry. So those apps that need to write into the program files area are probably going to have a problem out of the box with AppV 5.0. And you're going to need, as part of your installation, to specifically set the security rights in the folder or file so that that app will actually work for the client. Okay. So that's a change that comes in there. Yeah, Mike?
I know that in order to get an existing 4.6 package, you have to go through an upgrade process.
Yep.
Does it carry, if the existing package has no security descriptors, and then you pull that up to 5.0, does it then overlay whatever the file system descriptors are, or will it leave it intact?
Okay, so the question was, in 4.6, we may or may not have security descriptors, and if we upgrade that package, because we will need to do an upgrade of those packages to 5.0, because it is a different format, will those security descriptors come over and be respected? The answer to the question is yes. Okay, I believe so. In the case of when you sequence the application and you disable the security descriptor checkbox, effectively what you do inside that package is you make every file read-writable, and that is what should come over. Okay. All right. Now, let's talk about upgrading packages since you brought it up. We do need to upgrade the packages. Microsoft has created some tooling to help us with this, and the tooling comes in the area of the sequencer. So there is an upgrade process that you can use that's there. Now, what Microsoft is also done, I haven't really talked about yet, is they've made everything PowerShellable. In fact, I would actually say anything that is an API in the new version of the product, PowerShell is the API. So if you don't know PowerShell and you're going to work with AppV 5.0, better learn a little bit. So there's 2 PowerShell commands on the sequencer to help you with that conversion. Now the great thing about this conversion is it doesn't make the sequencer dirty. So you can have a PowerShell script that just loops through your entire folder of existing packages and just try to convert them all and have them, drop the output out into another folder and just let it run, come back tomorrow and see how things worked. There's 2 PowerShell commands that are in there. One is to test the package to see if it's a good candidate, if it's likely to work. So they'd run a lot of tests in there just for things that they know will automatically break if you just try to convert the package. And then there's another one to do that conversion. Okay? But as I said, the great thing is it doesn't dirty the sequencer. Okay. So when we look at the client, first thing that we see is that there's no Q drive. I need to watch my time. I don't want to keep you away from the geek out. All right, so we see there's no Q drive. They've also changed the console. The console is Silverlight. Does that make sense to anybody in this room? Why at this date they would go to Silverlight doesn't make any sense to me. I wrote a blog post, went out yesterday with the beta up on my blog at www.tmerchant.com. Look for the blog link and it's there. And in that blog post, I said that it's a console your mother won't hate. Okay, it's a lot better than MMC. Okay, but it does mean that you have to install Silverlight on all the clients. Okay, you also have to install it on the sequencer, along with the .NET Framework 4.0 and PowerShell 3.0. PowerShell 3.0, by the way, is currently a release candidate, so it's still kind of coming as well. One of the other odd notes that happened that I noticed with Beta 2 is that Beta 2 only works with Windows 7 and above. Now, the previous beta worked with Vista and above. I think this is a temporary thing, and it's related to the fact that they don't have a good PowerShell 3.0 answer right now for Vista. So they're working on that. So I'm expecting that comes back. But Windows XP has not been on their list ever. And I think considering the timing of release and the end of life of XP, I wouldn't expect it to show up. So you need to be aware of that. Now, Microsoft is covering us a little bit here in that we also have what is called the coexistence mode. So we, for the first time, have the ability to have a client machine with 2 different versions of AppV on it. 2 specific versions, but 2 versions. 4.6 SP2, you can leave on the machine and start doing new things with AppV 5.0. Have both of the clients on the machine, and then as you then start to get some of your old stuff converted over, eventually you can make that older client go away. I'm not sure how many people are really going to want to do that. But if you need to get to 5.0 quickly for a particular reason, and you just don't have time to convert all those packages over, it's a strategy you could use. I hope it would be a short-lived strategy. I don't love the idea of having 2 different clients up there at the same time. Okay, so let's talk about the transparency piece. Once I have these packages that are on the client, I talked about that folder earlier, right? The stuff is mounted there. So I can go into C, Program Data, Microsoft AppV, Package GUID, Package Version GUID, and I will see all of the actual executables that are there. So there'll be a folder called root, and that's the thing that everything is installed to, right? That's your install folder. And in there, we'll still see a VFS tab, kind of the folder the way we did before. But you'll actually see all of the executables there from outside the package. You don't need to be in the virtual environment to see any of that stuff. When you look at the shortcuts that get published, the shortcuts in AppV 4.6 say C program files, blah, 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 sft tray.exe, the name of the application, right? In AppV 5.0, you're actually going to see C program data, Microsoft, AppV, GUID, root, outlook.exe. Okay? Yeah?
Can my application auditing platforms pick that up now?
Yeah, absolutely. Right? That's part of this transparency thing. They're making it wide open. No matter how the user finds a way to launch that file, it will launch as a virtual application in its bubble. Okay? We've had a lot of problems with 4.6 where we try to make something virtual, particularly like Internet Explorer, right? And users always have another way to start IE, no matter what you do, right? Now we have a way to make that happen so that no matter how they start it, AppV is going to intercept the launch and say, oh, wait a minute, this is a virtual application. I need to build the virtual environment, and now here you go. Okay? It's actually kind of a more natural way to do that. We also get some things that sometimes I love it and sometimes I hate it. I haven't really decided where I stand on it. So we've got these things called dynamic deployment files. There's a deployment config and a user config. So we have our package and it has all of its settings and all of the assets. It's got the virtual registry. It's got all the shortcuts and the file associations all defined in the package. But sometimes we don't want to deploy everything like that to every user. And we want things to be a little bit different. The deployment and user config files give us a way to do that. It's in essence an override to all of those file associations and shortcuts, so that as well as what we now call protocol handlers. So things that we didn't have in the past, like mail to as part of an application, right? Those types of shell extensions are now supported in AppV 5.0. But we can override these things in the deployment files. So the idea between these two is the deployment config is something that's applied when the package arrives to an operating system and is published to it. So if we think about a terminal server, it's when the package arrives no matter what user brought it in. The user config is an override that affects that particular user when the package is published to that user. So it gives us some real flexibility in there. Now the bad news is these are XML files that you have to manually edit. Okay? In the sequencer, you don't get a chance to change this stuff. You just get the entire thing. And if you need to do different deployments to different groups, you're going to need to manually do some XML editing in order to get these things set right. And then you need to also get them to be applied. So if you're using the full management server, that's part of the publishing process there. You get to edit the configurations and stuff. But if you're deploying it manually or through SCCM, you have to be sure that those configs get deployed with the package. It's not just the package itself. So I'm not real happy with it today. I like some of the functionality we're getting in here, but I still think it needs a little work. One of the really nice things, though, that I love with it is that the deployment config, this is also where scripts come in. So in the past, we had scripting in the OSDs. All of the scripting that you would have done in an OSD now go in either the deployment or user config file. The ones that run as a deployment config are running under a system context. That opens up a lot of opportunities for us. Now, the ones under the user config run under the user context. So let's say I have a package that has a device driver. AppV doesn't support device drivers. Now we can put the script to install the device driver in that deployment config file. So when it comes to the box, they get the device driver dependency natively installed under a system context just because a user logged in with the credentials that was published to. Right? That's going to solve a lot of our deployment problems. So in terms of the scripts that are there, we have not only something that goes at publishing time, the deployment, we also have an unpublished script that's available there. In the user config, we have a script associated with the user publishing and unpublishing. We also have a script associated with the package opening up or the package shutting down. And we have one for a particular application in the package starting up and shutting down. there's a lot of flexibility of what we can do there in the scripting. I'm not quite sure how we're going to use it all, but I like the flexibility that they built in. Okay. Any questions on the scripting? All right. Oh yeah, let me not forget that one. That last bullet item, on a per package level, we can also say, I want to disable all the virtual isolation. Let me make sure I said the right word there, isolation. So virtualization is about redirecting things so that we find them in the right places. Isolation is about making sure things outside the package can't see it. And we have a checkbox that we can add that goes into the script on a per package basis that can say, I don't want any isolation with this package. That's one of the problems we have sometimes is that we isolate these things, but we still have things outside that need to interact. You know, that's where we end up using these, in the past, DSC or now connection groups, turning this feature on or off, depending on how you want to call it, but disabling the isolation might be another way to do it. Now, it really means, though, that you're losing a lot of the protections that AppV was giving you, so you're going to want to use that gingerly. But it might solve a problem here and there. Go ahead.
That give you the ability, though, to open up doing Office 2010. Your core packages would then be able to be virtualized but not isolated?
That could be a potential, although, well, you said 2010. So with 2010, that might be a very viable option. So currently, with Office 2010, Microsoft has a toolkit that you can use to work with AppV and deploy it. So you can sequence 2010, you can use this toolkit and deploy, and Microsoft recommends it, and myself and all of the other MVPs for the product don't recommend it. Okay? And the reason is that what our experience is that people use this, and it takes usually about 4 to 6 months before they get to the point that they realize that they're just getting hammered by other applications that they weren't aware integrated with Office, and they have a problem and they're trying to work around it. And they finally reach a point they say, you know, I'm just going to throw this thing out natively. You know, unless you're a shop that doesn't have a good way to deploy applications natively, Office is right now not a good candidate. Now, Office 2013 might be a different story. Okay, Office 23 just came out in beta. Beta? Review? Yeah, whatever they call it, right? It's okay, fine. It's still a beta, right? Whatever they call it. That came out. They also came out with support for AppV 5 with that product, and it actually works more reasonably out of the box.
Yeah, the preview looks like it's in AppV format.
If you use the click to run version, that one is using AppV 5.0 under the covers, although Microsoft will never admit that.
Will Microsoft start delivering applications in the AppV format? You have an option to not download an ISO format or AppV format?
Good question. Actually, one of the betas that they just sent me the link to this afternoon appears to be Office 2013 pre-sequenced. So it looks like maybe they are going to go that way, at least for some things. Now, are they going to do it across the board? Hell no. You know, that would be way too using their own technology. Okay, so this is the scripting stuff that we talked about. Connection groups. Connection groups replace the DSC. So dynamic suiting, the way that worked previously was you sequenced an application and you had another application you wanted to work with it. And so you'd take the original sequence package and you'd expand it out to the system on the sequencer. And then you'd use the sequencer to install the dependent package, right? And then you would manually go and edit these OSD files to create the linkage between them. And if you're just having to do that with, a couple pieces that need to work together, it's no big deal. But as soon as you start having multiple DSC packages with lots of DSC combinations with lots of packages in them, it becomes completely unmanageable because there's no place you can go to in a console anywhere that's going to tell you what's related to what. It's something that has to be inside your head or that you separately document somewhere to be able to know that these things go together. So with AppV 5.0, one of the things we lose is the OSD file goes away. You know, the OSD file was that basically a launching handle that was, in essence, a script that was used to say, oh, here's what the virtual application in the package is supposed to be. Now that we have that more natural launching mechanism, we don't need the OSDs, those go away. So they came up with this idea of connection groups. Now, when we talk about the management server, the connection groups become first-class citizens in that they're actually publishable objects. So you'll have your packages, you'll go into the management server, say, I want a connection group, and I want these two packages to work together. Now, the connection groups also have priorities. So if I've got these three applications I have on the screen, I can have a connection group that has the first two packages, and I can have another connection group with these two packages. Now, if I did that, and if I launch application 1, then I'm going to get automatically connection group 1 with those two packages in it. If I launched 3, I would get the combination from the second connection group with 2 and 3 in it. But if I launch number 2, it can't be sure which one to do, and that's where priority comes into place. So each of those connection groups has a priority, and whichever has the greater priority, app 2 will launch inside of that bubble. Okay, the server. Where we used to have 2 pieces to the server, we now get 3 pieces to the server. So the third one is that reporting server. It just came new in the beta 2 release yesterday. Okay? So we get a whole new database. In fact, not only do we get one new database, we get 2 new databases. Even better. I don't understand the thinking behind this, but what Microsoft says is that they heard feedback, and so they wanted to break up the AppV database into 2 separate pieces: a relatively static configuration database and a reporting database. And so that's what they've done. So we have a management server that when you install that component has the configuration database. So that's where you're going to go in, and when you add packages in and assign them to users, all of that configuration information goes into that database. When clients run applications and report information back through the reporting server, that's going to go into a reporting database that just has information about what applications they ran, what's been deployed to their machine, who that machine is, that type of information. I'm finding this to be really weird because if I want to think about doing any reporting, I want to do it against the combination of those. Right? I need to know who's supposed to have the applications to compare against who's actually running them. Right? Now that information is in 2 different databases. I'm thinking this is a real good opportunity for a third party to step in and develop a solution, quite frankly.
It's kind of like the way software used to try and chop it up to do that disparate deployment, though, right? Because that was the point, was when you start to break apart the SQL, you're trying to get the reporting stuff into the remote site so they didn't have to cross the wires.
That was more of a transmission issue, right? Here they're thinking about backups and risk, you know, that the configuration database should be relatively static, and if something happens with a bad reporting record coming in and destroying the database, which I've never heard of happening in AppV, but if it did, then you could screw up your configuration, I suppose. I don't know, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. You know, I want to be able to do a join against those 2 things. Now, I was just talking to Sean Baskin. I'm not a SQL expert myself. And Sean tells me that as long as the databases are on the same machine, I still should be able to do a join across them. It won't be as efficient, but I should still be able to do it. But as I said, I'm not a SQL expert. But I'll bend to Sean, you know. Yes, Sean. Okay. So with the server, we get a new console there, also Silverlight based. All of the activities between these machines are HTTP or HTTPS based. So, you know, that old RTSP stuff is gone away completely. Everything is based on using IIS and browsing-like capabilities to get at things. There is a Silverlight console. We have a great PowerShell interface there as well. And then we have these three parts. So the management server is the piece. It's got a database. That's where you're going to bring application or packages into, where you're going to assign users, set those configuration files, and get that all set. Second, we have a publishing server. The publishing server is the piece that actually talks to the client. So where the client in the past would go to would actually talk to the management server itself to bring things down. Now it's actually a separate publishing server, and we can have multiples of those, and they've solved the site problem that we used to have in the past. Now, I'll have a diagram here in just a second. The reporting server is a separate server where clients report usage information back in. So that's, by the way, the new management database layout. It's much simpler than the old one. It's very straightforward. I don't think people are going to have any problem working with that database. Okay, so this is what they've done. They've tried to make this system scale more like the way System Center scales. So the old AppV server scaled up, and they want to be able to scale out in this one. So we've got this idea where we've got this database, we've got this management server, and then we get a publishing server, and it talks to the client kind of through there. One big difference is that under the old system, the client would wake up and say, hey, give me my apps, and that stuff would come down. The client would go out of band to a share somewhere to say, oh, I need the OSD file and the icon. But when it went to stream the applications, that streaming happened over RTSP back through this publishing server to get at it. In 5.0, the process starts out, give me my apps, but then the client will get everything from that direct link. Okay, so the publishing server isn't used to deliver bits. Okay. So as we go with multiple sites, we can drop a publishing server out here now, and we used to have some issues with wanting to do this. They had this idea that they called the streaming server that you could put out at the site. I refer to that as the brain dead server because it was absolutely stupid, and recommended that nobody use it because you could actually just use overrides here at the client to do that up there. But we can decide to use the publishing server or not. So what happens here at the site is that when the management server gets these records updated in the database, the publishing server on a configurable basis will wake up, talk to the management server over HTTP and say, hey, tell me what's changed in the app world here. Give me the new information. And so that'll come over and reside here. And now the client will say, give me my apps, and the publishing server can just say, okay, here they are. And as long as you've replicated your storage out to somewhere close by, then the client will get all the heavy data directly there locally. So that works pretty well. Now, at what point does putting one here actually make sense? That's part of what we're going to have to figure out, because this client could just as easily talk to the publishing server there, because it's not a lot of data when they make that request to give me my apps. But once you get enough clients here, then it starts to become worthwhile. So it depends on how much bandwidth you've got on that link and how expensive it is for you to drop another server at that site, and how many clients you have is kind of the thinking behind there. Okay, so the report server looks like another machine. Now, of course, I can install these components all on a single machine, but you can do them separately. And the connection there goes that the client is going to be configured to wake up and send its reporting data up there. Now, it's very configurable. You'll be able to set a starting time when it should start sending things, so like maybe at 10 o'clock at night. You can add in a randomization interval to the client, so when it does wake up at 10 o'clock, it's then going to wait some random time period. You give it like up to 2 hours, you could say. So then sometime between 10 and midnight, each of the clients will then actually talk to the reporting server and send their stuff up. You can set limits on the amount of data that it can send in a single instance as well. So it looks pretty well designed in that fashion, other than the fact that it's going into a separate database. And technically, yes, there's no reason you couldn't put a reporting server over here, although you'd have segregated results in different databases. Okay. This is the kind of information you would get out from that report, from application usage. So we can see information like, what the application was, the version was. The server in here means the source where it got the .appv file from the publishing. Who the user was, the package version information, if it was in a connection group, that shows up. What time they launched it, and what time they shut it down. And we got this launch status that I don't know what the heck it means. It always just says that as far as I can tell. Okay. But that's what's kind of in that report that goes back into the reporting database. Okay. Some of the concerns that I see in this system are that these deployment configs, I really feel like some of the features that are in there should be in the base package itself. All of the scripting and that, if I know I have to get a device driver installed in a deployment config-like thing, why can't I do it in the original copy, which is in a manifest XML that's inside my .appv file? And the reason is that the sequencer doesn't support me doing that, and that as of right now, I've got no way to externally open up that .appv file and make those changes there. That's one of the complaints I get into Microsoft, and I don't think they're listening at this point. All right. And it's a bit of a pain, even with the management server, to edit these dynamic configs. So in the management server, we have some limited capabilities to edit on a per user group basis things like I want to remove and only do these shortcuts to this user, or I want to remove these file associations. So I can do that from the management server. But all the scripting stuff I can't do. I have to actually export an XML file, manually edit that, and then re-import it back into the server. The protocol handlers. There is no visibility in the sequencer that any of that stuff is going on. So we see shortcuts, we can see file associations, but we can't see these new things. And I think that should be visible in the sequencer. I think that's a transparency thing that we need to know is going on there. I shouldn't have to then go and look at the default deployment config file to see were there any protocol handlers in there, because right now that's the only way I can do it. There are shell extensions that work now that didn't before, but there are a bunch that still don't work. We don't really know what's going to work in the final product. Microsoft isn't documenting any of that right now. So for example, right now property sheets don't work. Mail to works. The send tos, like the WinZip type stuff, that stuff's now working. So we are gaining things, but it's not clear what we're going to get anymore. The thing that we used to use in the old AppV to do that virtualization, I said, we had these environment variable-like things. Those are CSIDLs. CSIDLs go away in this product, but they're replaced. So this is something that I've seen coming for a while. CSIDL is a very old technology to define standard places on a machine. So it's something Microsoft put in place, I think around Windows 2000, maybe NT, for developers to be able to say, oh, I need to know where the My Documents folder is. And so they created these things that are kind of like environment variables that a developer could use called CSIDL. So CSIDL documents is where the My Documents folder happens to be in this particular instance. We latched onto that when we built the product originally, and everything was based on these CSIDLs. A few years ago, around the Vista timeframe, Microsoft deprecated CSIDLs for a new thing they call base folders. And it's really the same thing with new names. And AppV has stayed with CSIDLs, and there are new things coming that there are no CSIDLs for, so they've been kind of adding some things in as their own private environment variables. And what they decided to do here is rather than go to base folder names, they decided they'll do all private names now. So thank you. Everything in the renaming that goes on there, the neutralization of this package, now uses these proprietary names. And I'm not sure if that's going to cause us any problems.
I think that, I don't know for sure whether they're using it. I don't think that CSIDLs are even in Windows 8. that we tried to run with the 4.6SP1 client that were broken. So we went in and corrected the CSIDL references to actual path references in the packages. I wonder if even in 8 they've said that's.
Maybe they're gone. It could be. That would bring even more reason for then needing a 4.6SP2 to run on Windows 8. Yeah, good, very good, very good. In general, I would say that what we should find is that the body of applications that worked well with AppV in 4.6, when we compare that to 5.0, that body should grow. I'm not convinced that everything that works in 4.6 is going to work in 5.0. I would not be surprised to see that there are some packages that will start recommending, no, that's not a good candidate, when it used to be. I don't know exactly what those packages are going to be, but I just got a feeling that so many things here are changing that we're going to find them as we go through them. All right. Storage of the changes that a user makes. So when an AppV application runs, changes that users make get stored in a special place in AppV 4.6. So these are the PKG files. This was another one of those little black holes, right? PKG was an undocumented format for a long time. Not only was it undocumented, both Kalle Sumanaki, who's an MVP up in Finland, and myself independently spent years trying to break that format, because it was the most obscure format you've ever seen, and we could never figure it out. I finally got Microsoft to work with me to try to document that thing, and they did a couple years ago. So we now have some tools, like I've got a free tool called the Package Viewer, that you can go in and see those changes are, right? Because what would happen is the user would run the application. You have lots of users running the applications, but then you get this user that something would go wrong, and their app wasn't working anymore. And so we would then tell the help desk, well, just reset their package, which basically deleted all of their personalizations with that package and started them over from scratch, and it solved the problem. I mean, certainly it was a hell of a lot better than deleting the user's profile, which is the equivalent of what you would have done without AppV, but still wasn't very nice. So what we want to be able to do is then go in and see what actually got saved in there. Is there something that I can just eliminate surgically rather than have to blow away the entire thing? Or if it's a recurring problem, figure out what is going on there and maybe find a way to keep that problem from happening in the future. So with AppV 5.0, we no longer have these little black hole PKGs. Things are stored differently, right? They're still segregated on a per package basis or per connection group basis, but they're a little more native. Particularly, all of the registry changes actually are stored inside the Windows registry. Okay? Not in their normal location, but they are there in the registry. So one of my concerns is, what's that going to break? I think we have a potential of some problems in there. In particular, what I'm thinking about here is the user environment management products. Where do the file system changes go? Do you remember? It's by default, it is configurable, and by default, I believe it's in the app data roaming folder for the user.
Doing the same thing now that it's been doing with the streaming for quite many years.
Yeah. You know, they certainly look at what everyone's doing and try to pick from the best. I mean, that's kind of a standard Microsoft way, right? Come late, but come often. All right. Okay, so we don't know the release schedule. The Office thing is now available. I haven't updated the slide yet because that's just really new. Although I have taken, even prior to Beta 2, I sequenced the pre-release of Office 2013, and the version of this slide deck that you're not seeing because it won't talk to the monitor was actually running on AppV 5.0 with the beta of the PowerPoint 2013. So it works, I mean, just out of the box in terms of getting it up and running, it was much smoother. I didn't have to do a lot of any weird tricks. There were still issues with it, but I think if I did this again now with Beta 2 and the new version of that they released to work with AppV, I'm thinking that that would probably work a lot smoother now. Okay. SCCM. So SCCM knows about AppV 4.6. It has special stuff that's in there. We need changes to support AppV 5.0 and SCCM. So that comes in SCCM 2012 SP1. That is also out in beta. I have not looked at that. Is Kevin still in the room? Kevin Kaminsky? Oh, okay, I saw him in here earlier. I think Kevin's looked at it. I'm not sure how good that is yet. But presumably, if considering how much effort they spent on the management server, I'm sure they spent a lot of time with the SCCM team in making sure that they got that right. Okay, so we've got 5 minutes. Okay. I want to show you a little bit of information on launch. Now, this is not a benchmark. Okay? Let me say that again. This is not a benchmark. This is just some guy that ran some tests and came up with some data that may or may not be valid. Okay? All right. I took a look at some performance between AppV 4.6 and a native deployment of an application, and also the AppV 5 and that. And I've got 2 slides here for you. The first one here is looking at the launch time. And this is really where most of the performance concerns with AppV come into place. That launches, when the user runs the application and starts it up, take longer with AppV than they do. Once the app is up, usually the performance is pretty reasonable on most applications. So here was 4.6 SP1, where I was looking at 84, whatever the hell was, milliseconds on this particular example versus 108 when it was virtualized. So, you know, we have a little bit of overhead that's in there. Typically, you know, we're talking here in the range of, you know, 15 to 20% on a launch is often the case. It really depends what's inside the application. And the next chart really helps show that out here. With 5.0, and this was the beta 1, I did run some tests on beta 2. It didn't seem to change very much, but I really didn't do the kind of testing I should have done, so that's why I'm not showing those numbers. In beta 2, you know, outside the virtual environment, I was seeing this. Now, this was a different machine, and the fact that I had AppV 5 on this machine versus AppV 4 actually slowed down the natural applications themselves. Because there's so much more that's been being written into the registry with AppV 5.0, and that was kind of a surprise to me. But when I launched it inside the virtual environment, that overhead seemed to be a little bit higher. Now, this is still beta, right? I mean, you know, this is still an early beta. I would expect that Microsoft would be looking at performance in the late stages, right? In early stages, they should be worrying about features, and they'll probably be tuning this to have it work better. I also want to look at different types of overhead. Because there's some weird things that are out there from apps like ArcGIS performs horribly under AppV 4.6. And I've done some research into it. Some people have done some isolation, and they've come to the conclusion that the reason it performs badly is because that particular application does an awful lot of trying to enumerate registry keys that don't exist. And they've come to the conclusion that the AppV does that so horribly that that's the cause of this. All right, so we look at file system, just enumerating everything, enumerating and opening, and this is actually reading them. And we can see in 4.6, we get, you know, between 8 to 24% overhead is what I calculated on those tests in 4.6 versus a native application. In 5.0, those numbers actually come down. The file performance in the new file system seems better than in the old file system. So that's a great thing. When I look at the registry, we can, enumerating registry reads, I was seeing 56% overhead in AppV 4.6 for reading. But for writing, I actually had a negative overhead. Okay? When the virtual application goes to write all of that registry stuff, if it writes it to the real registry, that's got to go into the kernel and get fully committed so that any other application would see the same registry setting. With AppV, and we've virtualized it, those writes that are going into the virtual registry don't have to do that in the kernel, and that synchronization doesn't have to happen. And that actually, I believe, is the cause of these numbers here. It's much faster on those things to do it in a virtual application. Okay? And then the last one was the example. I had to write some tools to do this. It's a tool that would go in and do 1 million enumerations for things that don't exist. And there is quite a bit of overhead on that. I saw 120% overhead in AppV 4.6. I'll get to you in a second. 120% overhead in AppV 4.6. So if something would take 2 milliseconds, then we're talking 2 would be 4, 6, a little over 6 milliseconds, right? That's a significant amount, but it does not explain ArcGIS because ArcGIS went from, I think, 30 seconds in launch time to 5 minutes. And that's not 120% overhead. So I still don't know what's going on with ArcGIS. That's not the cause, though. There's something else going on. All right, so I am out of time. I'm going to mention I got a new book that's out, in case you didn't hear that. And you can get information from us at www.tmerchant.com. And thanks for coming. And she's got some flyers if you're interested.